there and welcome back to my channel. This channel is for English learners who want to study at a college or university in the United States or another English-speaking country. I've been teaching English for more than 20 years and I have tons of tips to share with you for how to be successful in school or work in an English-speaking country. Today I have a short video for you about one of the most basic things that you need to know as a college or university student in the US. It's how should you address your professor? First, I'm going to introduce an important vocabulary word. Then I'll tell you 3 ways that you can call your professor, and then 3 ways that you should never call your professor. So to get started, let's look at the vocabulary word for today. The vocabulary word is address. Address. Address is a verb here, and it has stress on the second syllable, address. Now, this is completely different from the noun address. Address is like the place that you live or the number on a street. But the verb address means to use a specific name or title when you talk to someone or write to someone. Let me give you a few examples. How should I address my professor? When I was a child, I addressed my neighbor as sir. This means that when I saw my neighbor and I spoke to my neighbor, I called him sir, probably because he was older and I wanted to show respect. In England, when people speak to the Queen, they call her Your Majesty. Now notice that these words or sentences are talking about situations where you are speaking to a person of a higher rank or a more formal situation. For example, if I talk to my boss or my professor or my doctor or a king, I probably will use a title to show respect for that person. So let's get to the question of today's video. How should you address your professor? The best way to address your professor is professor plus the last name. If your professor's last name is Johnson, for example, you will say, "Excuse me, Professor Johnson, I have a question." Now, I know that it's hard to remember all your professors' names, especially in a second language, but it's really important to pay attention to your professors' last names because when you speak to your professor and you use the last name, it shows respect. My tip for you is pay attention to how to pronounce and spell your professor's last names and practice saying the professor's name many times until you feel comfortable saying it. You want to be able to say, "Excuse me, Professor so-and-so," very easily. Another way that you can address your professor is to use just the title professor with no name. "Excuse me, Professor, I have a question." This is okay too, but it's better to use professor plus the last name. What about using a professor's first name? Now, in the United States, sometimes it happens that a professor will invite the students to use his or her first name. And it's up to you. If the professor tells the students, "You can call me by my first name," for example, if the professor's first name is Amanda, last name Johnson, and she tells the students, "You can call me by my first name, you can call me Amanda," then you can say, "Excuse me, Amanda, I have a question." But if you prefer to continue to use professor plus the last name, "Excuse me, Professor Johnson," that's okay too. In my experience as a student, I had some professors that I knew well, and those were the professors who invited me to call them by their first name. Maybe I had them for more than one semester or more than one class. But for a professor that I didn't know as well, a professor I had only one class or one semester, the relationship was more formal and I always called them professor plus their last name. What about the title doctor? Have you ever heard a professor who is called doctor? What this means is that the professor has a PhD, which is the highest level of education in the United States. Many professors have a PhD, and some of them like to be called doctor. My tip for you is, on the first day of class, take a look at the syllabus and notice how your professor refers to himself or herself. If your professor has the title doctor on the syllabus, that means that the professor likes to be called doctor. But with doctor, we always use the last name. Excuse me, Dr. Johnson, I have a question. However, if you prefer the word professor, you can use that too. Professor is always okay. Now I'm going to tell you 3 ways that you should never address your professor. The first one is Mr. or Mrs., Miss, Ms. These titles are used for elementary and high school teachers. And because they are used for a different level of school, we don't use them to call a college or university professor. It's not really wrong, but it's better to stick with professor. The next one is teacher. For example, excuse me, teacher, I have a question. We never say this, and in fact, it's considered a little bit impolite or inappropriate. So be sure that you don't call your professor teacher. And in fact, we don't even use teacher to talk to or to call teachers from elementary or high school. We just don't use this title. The last one is Miss or Mr. plus the first name. For example, my name is Jenna, and if a student calls me Miss Jenna, that is not a good idea. The reason for this is that we use Miss or Mr. plus the first name for preschool, which is the school for very small children. And for that reason, we do not use it in college or university. To wrap up, the vocabulary word for today is the verb address, which means to use a specific name or title when you speak or write to someone. And we use this word a lot when we talk about how we should call someone in a more formal situation or to show respect. The best way to call your professor is professor plus the last name. However, it's also okay to use just professor. Some professors will invite the students to call them by their first name. However, you must wait until they invite you. It's considered rude if you call your professor by their first name unless they invite you to do so. What about doctor? Some professors like to be called doctor. Make sure you check the syllabus to see how your professors refer to themselves. And remember 3 ways you should never address your professors: Mr. or Mrs., teacher, or Miss or Mr. plus the first name. Let me know in the comments below what you would like me to talk about in upcoming videos, and please remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss any of those videos. And you can also check me out on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks so much, and see you next time.